the Executive Manager for Pearson's English Initiatives and Partnership Programs. I'm glad you could join us today, and I hope you'll find the ideas presented by our speaker valuable for your teaching. For those who are new to the webinar format, I have a few quick reminders before the session begins. If you're calling in by phone, please know that this is not a toll-free number. For that reason, we recommend that you select Use Mic and Speakers so you can listen toll-free through your computer speakers. You may notice that your line has been muted. This is to minimize ambient noise as well as interruptions for our speaker. We encourage you to ask questions using the box marked Questions on the right-hand side of your screen. You can ask questions at any point during the presentation, and when the formal presentation is over, I'll use the remaining time to pose as many of your questions as possible to our speaker. Any questions we don't get to will be forwarded along with your email address to the speaker directly, so all questions will be answered one way or another. If you want to keep up with the conversation on Twitter, follow @PearsonNorthAM and use hashtag PearsonLearn. Okay, so let's get started. Today's session is Teaching for Transfer, Strategies for First-Year Composition and Beyond, and our speaker is Dr. Charles Paine. Dr. Paine is a professor of English at the University of New Mexico, where he directs the undergraduate writing program and teaches courses in first-year, intermediate, and professional writing. He is an active member of the Council of Writing Program Administrators and currently serves on its executive board. He co-founded and coordinates the Consortium for the Study of Writing in College, a joint effort of the National Survey of Student Engagement and the Council of Writing Program Administrators. The consortium conducts general research into the ways that undergraduate writing can lead to enhanced learning, engagement, and other gains related to student success. Dr. Paine is the author of Writing Today and The Resistant Writer, Rhetoric as Immunity. And with Joseph Harris and John Miles, he co-edited a collection of new essays teaching with student texts. In this webinar, he'll introduce some of the concepts and difficulties concerning transfer, but will devote the majority of the time to discussing practical, workable strategies that facilitate transfer. These strategies include helping students develop a theory of writing and using a shareable vocabulary for discussing what they do and why, adopt problem exploring rather than answer getting dispositions, motivate their learning by showing them how their writing skills will be relevant to their personal goals, and learn to think like writers by mingling theory with practice, using assignment sequences that invite them to repurpose their writing for new contexts and to reflect on the principles and past experiences they've used to meet the demands of these new contexts. Chuck, are you ready to get started?
I'm ready.
Great, thank you.
Okay, let me get the right screen here. All right. So is everybody seeing my screen now?
We got it.
Okay, great. Hello, everybody. This is Chuck. I'm out here in Albuquerque. I have to correct one thing. I'm no longer on the executive board of the WPA. I did my time, served my 3 years, and other people are taking their shoulder at the wheel now. I'm also, I just want to point out, you can see I have my collaborator here, Rick Johnson Sheehan from Purdue University. Like me, he is WPA. He's actually the past WPA Writing Program Administrator at Purdue. I'm still currently doing it here at UNM. You want to say hello, Rick?
Hello, everyone. I'm just jumping in here. Chuck and I usually do these things together, kind of like the click and clack of the webinar world, and so I thought I'd just hang out and see what Chuck had to say. And my job is to say things that make Chuck look really smart. So. And also, I direct the writing lab here at Purdue, so I guess I am a WPA in some sense still. So.
Right. Yeah, the famous Purdue Owl. Yeah, and also I just think it helps everybody to hear two voices instead of one. Plus, you know, Rick and I, there's a lot of similarities between our writing programs, but they differ in some ways, and we can sort of talk about some of those differences. Okay, so let's talk about teaching for transfer. First question you might have is, if I can, there we go, is you know, what's all this fuss over transfer? It seems like it was a word that wasn't in my vocabulary before, I don't know, the year 2000 or so, but we learned, you know, when I first started as a professor back in 1994, I was content to teach the academic writing and academic essay, and although, you know, the field has pretty much given up on, has realized that current traditional rhetoric and the 5-paragraph theme are, you know, don't help students learn to write. We did have some things to learn about about how well our skills are transferring. I think we have just kind of assumed that our skills transferred. And all learning involves some sort of transfer. The story that all writing teachers hear in their universities and colleges is from the economics professor or whatever who accosts them in the hall and talks about how bad their students' writing is, and what the heck are we doing in first-year composition anyway? And I have to tell you, my son he just became his first year. He's a teaching assistant in the biology department, and I couldn't believe it. My own son asked me the other night, "Dad, what are you doing in that class?" Anyway, the point is that they are perceiving that whatever we're teaching them is not transferring to what they're doing. So, and a few books. Two books that I think were kind of instrumental in really getting this conversation going was The End of Composition Studies by David Smith. I think that was about 2004, where he really takes a hard look at what we're doing and suggests, should we end composition studies, and also what are the goals of composition studies, and that we really do need to pay attention to transfer. In College Writing and Beyond, a terrific book, 2007, that's Utah State University Press. It's a qualitative study of one writer, Tim, who's a history major, and chronicles his difficulty in transferring his what he learned in first year writing to his history, the projects he was doing in history. And we would certainly think that but they actually didn't, even in that sort of near transfer situation. And then we had this focus group qualitative study by Linda Bergman and Janet Zepernick, who asked students how who asked students who were juniors and seniors how their first year composition course related to what the writing they were doing in college. And they said their conclusion is students failed to see any connection between what they've learned about writing in English classes and the writing demanded elsewhere in their academic and professional lives. So I think, as I said, I think we've given up on, well, okay, the one point I want to make here is that teaching for transfer is not easier, and I hope you'll excuse the Boromir meme here, but maybe to sort of get the idea across. You remember in the movie, Boromir says, "One does not simply walk into Mordor," and this is a meme that's going all over the internet. But it is true. Although one thing I want to impress upon everybody is that transfer doesn't automatically happen the way we may have assumed it did in the past, but it's also not rocket science. We can there's fairly easy to use strategies that will work. I always like to show my students in the practicum this example to just show how tricky transfer can be. And this doesn't have anything to do with writing, but it was a 1980s study by Erickson, and he taught students how to memorize strings of digits, right? Over I think there was something like 35 sessions, but they took place over a year. And as you can see, as days of practice goes up, the students are able to memorize more digits. They start at about being able to memorize 7 digits, and by around the 40th lesson, the 40th day of practice, they had taught students to memorize a string of 80 digits, which is pretty remarkable. So the question is, well, how well does that ability to transfer digits transfer to learning strings of alphabetic characters? And the answer is not at all. When they changed the task to memorizing strings of alphabetic characters, the students started right where they were before, at 7 digits, and had to work their way up. I just think that's a really good dramatic example of how we always have to question our assumptions about transfer. One of the assumptions that we've had about writing, about teaching writing, was offered by David Russell in this very important study. I think it was 1996, and he talked about like teaching writing, generalized writing ability, if there is such a thing, is a lot like teaching ball handling, right? That you could teach ball handling, and students could use that one skill for all sports. And here we see, just to illustrate this, somebody practicing dribbling, but it's a much different ball handling skill to spike a volleyball or to dribble a soccer ball, right? And just as throwing a softball is different than throwing overhand baseball. They are very different skills that don't necessarily transfer to each other. And teaching writing is a little bit like that. Teaching one skill, one ball handling skill, doesn't necessarily transfer to these other areas. Okay, so the question is, what can we do about this? And I want to assure you that, again, this is not rocket science, but it certainly has caused us at my program at the University of New Mexico and people across the country to change what their assumptions and to change what they're doing. And this book right here, I'll be talking about this quite a bit. It's a terrific book by Kathy Yancey, Leanne Robertson, and Kara Taksic. And it's just out. I think it came out in April, and I'll talk a little bit more about this book later, but they say a Teaching for Transfer, or TFT course, can assist students in transferring writing knowledge and practice in ways other composition courses cannot. Okay, so how are we all doing? You have anything to add, Rick?
No, I think you're doing great.
Okay, thanks. Okay, let's start with just a few definitions. Okay, transfer of learning occurs when, and I'm taking these from Perkins, a very important, the godfathers of transfer, David Perkins and Solomon, who wrote in the International Encyclopedia of Learning in 1992, very important article about transfer, and the terms, or at least that we base our studies on. As I'll explain later, people are questioning some of those terms, and we're adding our own that are from writing studies. So transfer of learning occurs clearly when learning in one context enhances, as in the case of positive transfer, or undermines negative transfer, a related performance in another context. Okay, and then they distinguish, they make a famous distinction. I believe they invented this distinction between low road transfer and high road transfer. So low road transfer reflects the automatic triggering of well-practiced routines in circumstances where there's considerable perceptual similarity to the original learning context. And the example that they give and that people often give is that learning to drive a car, there is low road transfer between learning to drive a car and learning to drive a truck. They're perceived as very similar. There's very little negative transfer. Okay. On the other hand, high road transfer, if people are going to be managing complex transfer, what it requires is deliberate, mindful abstraction of skill or knowledge from one context to another. It doesn't happen automatically. It requires reflective thought in abstracting principles from the one context and identifying connections with others. It's very active, and if we want high road transfer to occur, which is necessary in teaching people about writing practice and knowledge, we need to use some of these high road strategies. And here I have just a little table that includes a few more terms that, as you may have heard about these or read about these. So low road transfer, when the contexts are very near, or as opposed to very far. They talk about the kind of task. Are you simply reusing something that you did before, like the gear shift on a car and the gear shift on a truck, or are you stretching into new areas? And they bring in the idea of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development here. And these next two are pretty much the same. Are very similar: instructional strategy and ease of transfer. Hugging refers to when we're preparing students for a performance in another context, and hugging, and we should be doing hugging when we can. So, for instance, if I'm preparing students if I give them practice tests in class and they do that as homework, there's not much difference between the practice tests and the performance tests. Those two contexts are very similar, and those two activities are very similar. However, bridging, I have to search for abstractions and things. So bridging might be where I'm asking students to repurpose a document for a different audience or put it into a different medium. Again, about something that I'll talk about later on. And finally, the assumptions, I believe this is Perkins and Solomon who came up with the Bo-Peep assumption of a low-road transfer, which just says leave them alone and they'll come home. That the transfer will automatically happen. I have to admit, I'm not going to speak for the whole field, but certainly this was my assumption for years and years. I remember when I was a brand new literature major and I was applying for a job in technical writing. I remember in an interview telling the person who was interviewing me, if I can write about the poetry of William Blank, I can write anything. I really believe that. He gave a derisive laugh, but he ended up hiring me. And it turned out that I did have a lot to learn, that I had to relearn how to write in order to become a technical writer. Okay, and then the assumption in high road transfer, and this is the assumption that I think the field is beginning to adopt, is we really have to design for transfer and make it explicit. I want to talk just a little bit about this term transfer and and the problem with it. This transfer, I believe, is first coined by Thorndike, Harvard psychology professor, around 1900. And the problem with this term transfer is that it suggests that learning is a thing. That you get in one place, you put in your mind, and then you plop it down into another place. When actually, it's much more complicated than that. Perhaps this picture gets the idea of transfer a little bit better. There's all sorts of different capacities that we push up the hill, but it's still, we have to stop thinking of learning as a thing and think of it as an activity and a very high level, and transfer as a high level activity. So, and as what we need to adopt a disposition of flexibility and openness so that they can adapt to different complex rhetorical situations. And some of the other terms that have been suggested are transformation, repurposing, or generalizing. But that's enough about that term, which is problematic. But let's go on. So as I was preparing for this, I was thinking, how can I collapse all these ideas into, as simple a schema as possible, and I hope I've succeeded with this. I'm sure it does not capture the full complexity of the discussion people are having about it, or how people are teaching for transfer, but I think for today's introduction, they're pretty good. The first principle is that you really need to employ constant reflection into your classroom. Students need to self-monitor. They need to abstract principles from activities, their own principles, ideally. They need to make connections between one writing task and another and abstract exactly what principles work and which don't from context to context. They need to be thinking about that. This is absolutely essential. It's a discussion we're having, me and my colleagues in our field, and that is the key terms that we use. But it is essential that in any one course anywhere, that you use a selected set of key terms that anchor all the shared talk and reflection about writing throughout the semester. It's sort of the Goldilocks principle here. You don't want it to be too complicated, but you don't want it to be too simple. As a writing program administrator, we are, and my colleagues and I, are working towards making these key terms universal across our entire curriculum, and because we think that's very important. It's a 2 or 3 sequence set of courses in the class, and we think it would really help students if every teacher used the same set of terms in each class. This assigned sequences with varied to writing and use not just word as mediums as well. Also, students with relevance, by showing that what they're doing are relevant, and by giving them lots of support so that they expect to be able to succeed. And then finally, we need to be explicit that the main goal, that we need to talk about transfer as the main goal for this course. Students are not used to that. It's very important. Obviously, as you can see from here, these 5 principles that I've condensed things down to they're not at all watertight. There's a lot of leakage between each one, as I think you'll see. And as I go through these, I realize that this is a lot of principles to take in. But after about 3 slides, I'm going to show you some concrete strategies that we use and that I've seen and that I've learned about other people using across the country that enact these principles. So this first principle is to employ constant but varied reflection. And we all know about metacognition and self-monitoring. But what we have found is that, and others have found, is that reflection is very difficult. Students don't know how to do it. Graduate students don't know how to do it. We all had to learn it. It needs to be part of almost every assignment and almost every activities. Students should be using those key terms that they have to talk about what they're doing, the rhetorical decisions they made. Put reflection and your key terms at the center of your goals, outcomes, and all of your activities. And again, from the very get-go, from the very first day, make reflection part of what you're doing in the class. I mean, the first reflection could be something about students reflecting upon their past writing practices and what they think writing is, a sort of beginning of the semester theory of writing. And what's really important is that they reflect both backwards and forward in time, making connections between the writing they've done in the past and the writing instruction they've had in the past and to the writing they're doing right now, and also to how this is going to relate to what they do in the future. This idea of dispositions, right? We want to encourage dispositions, as Elizabeth Wardle says, that are characterized by problem exploring rather than answer getting, right? A sort of openness. We want them to understand that when it comes to some writing, just as I was when I first became a technical writer, I was a have talked about the difference between border guarders, people who want to keep doing what they've always done, and boundary crossers, people who are willing to try out new things. And again, the reflection should vary, and they should be self-monitoring, and it should be sort of scaffolding so that they get more and more sophisticated as the semester goes on. And again, use these key terms. And the point is that students don't need really to be able to define these terms so much as to be able to use them. So, select the set that's right for you and your students, and sequence the key terms across the semester. For instance, Yancey, Robertson, and Taxack in that Writing Across Context books that I showed you early, this is the sequence of sort of in 4 sets of terms that they use throughout the semester. And these are similar to the ones that I use, and I think you use too, Rick. Am I right?
Yeah, no, I use a lot of these. I mean, that's what's kind of interesting is how the field is kind of settling on some terms that I think we feel comfortable with. I was thinking, I like this concept of backing up and kind of getting students thinking a little bit more critically about their writing. I was thinking back to the quote that you had from Linda Bergman and her co-author saying, students fail to see the connection between, what they learned in freshman English and what they were learning in advanced class. That's kind of shocking to me. I've seen that before. It's kind of like, how can they not see the connection? But what they're often missing is that bridge of terms that help them make the connection. So hopefully when they get to, let's say, the junior level or something, they see some terms again that they find familiar and kind of get a more critical perspective.
Yeah, the abundance, well, not abundance, but the many qualitative studies that have looked at these lately are really eye-opening. It's just, we forget how hard this is, and we need to keep in mind that this just doesn't happen automatically. Yeah. And again, students need to practice these terms. I don't give students quizzes on them. I don't think that works. But they do need to keep using them, and you need to keep using them. So an example, of connecting activity and experience with writing key terms. This is part of a prompt that I give actually for the final portfolio. And one of the things I ask them to do is come up with their own definition of a certain student learning outcome. And I'm working with these student learning outcomes. We talk about a learning outcome or two every single day in class, and they've been writing about them. And as I say here, I want them to give an extended definition. I want them to use stories, narration. I want them to use analogy and metaphor. I find that a particularly powerful way of doing things. of getting students to really get a grasp on this when they connect these to their own personal experiences that they know. And as I say at the very beginning, at the very end here, this was from a class that I taught last year. A student named Rigo talked about the writing process in terms of tuning a car. He was a car nut. And then Audrey was she was a gymnastics teacher, and so she talked about it in terms of figuring out gymnastic routines, changing the routine, and refining it. And it really helped them get a grasp on it. And then another way to get them using these three strategies, using key terms, reflecting, is to combine low, middle, and high stakes assignments in every sequence, and also combine domesticated genres, the ones we use in the academy, the essay, the research paper, even some of our low stakes assignments are domesticated, with what might be called wild genres, or Rick and I call them microgenres in our book. And those are genres that are used out in the real world that make me fun. Also combining modes, traditional print mode with new modes. And if you can get students, if you can give them a real audience, like profiling a campus resource, which a lot of our students are doing right now, that's great, where they're really explaining a resource and profiling it for a real audience. But you can't always do that, so you can sometimes give them fictional but realistic scenarios of rhetorical analysis. And again, throughout the semester, students should be practicing mini reflections throughout. I mean, every sequence, I think, should end with end with some sort of reflection. I'm not going to really go. Let me skip over this slide, but it just talks about how sequences go, how they move, how they progress forward to more and more sophisticated, from fun to academic. Right? It's a way of scaffolding. And I want to talk about these ideas. The really great thing about a genre approach is that you get to it allows your teacher to do some really enjoyable, inventive things with their students, right? So we all know about these high stakes and low stakes assignments. By the way, this middle stakes assignment is something I get from Chris Anson of North Carolina State. But as he points out, there's also this idea of the middle stakes assignment. And middle stakes assignments are these other kinds of genres. They're early drafts, but they're also these microgenres and wild genres. So for instance, on their way to writing a review, they might write a slam or a rave. On their way to writing a proposal, they might do a pitch. As a way of understanding a literary analysis, they might do a TV show character analysis or something like that. But it's really a lot of fun. I have to tell you, in the practicum taught by my colleagues, Professor Beth Davalon, Professor Kristen Elder, they have their students creating these assignment sequences, and they come up with these absolutely beautiful creative assignment sequences that their students love, and using brand new genres that are just emerging. So a genre might look, a sequence might look like this, where on the bottom you have sort of activities that you're doing, and then on the top you have two low stakes assignment that lead up to this major genre of the evaluation. But then it always ends with, the way we do it, with a reflection that asks students to reflect on what they've done, the decisions they made, in the language of the student learning outcomes, which use the key terms of the course. I'm going to move through this as well. Just want to point out, here's some of the extended families of sort of major genres you might do, and microgenres and wild genres. And again, these are just they're just terrific, and they're emerging all the time. So, for instance, as you're moving students towards some sort of argument, an argumentative essay or whatever, you might have them do a rebuttal, an editorial. You might also have them do a rant, which they like a lot, and debate and dialogue. And then as they move from, say, the rant to the argument, they can talk about how an argument is similar to a rant, but different from a rant. In a rant, you don't have to think about the other side. In an argument, you do have to think about the other side. But they're both alike in the sense that they are they're putting forth the position. And you can show family resemblances as you do this. Over here on the left, we have the elevator pitch, which is a sort of a wild genre, and a proposal. And as you can see, that there's a lot of similarities between them, but very, very different contexts. a proposal is written. It can be 10 pages long. An elevator pitch is 1 minute to 3 minutes. It takes place face-to-face. The strategies are similar, but significantly different. And then you can also mix things up with going multimodal, right? Having students make podcasts or make videos of elevator pitches or whatever they're doing. It's a lot of fun. Students like it. Or you also mash up genres, have them do crazy things with genres. I mean, what would happen if they wrote a report in the style of a memoir, or if they wrote a memoir in the style using the features and style of a report? And they can have a lot of fun with that. They all understand what mashups are and how they work. Okay. The other thing that I like about a genre approach and about teaching for transfer in general is that it motivates students because it shows them how this writing is going to be relevant to the writing they do. Unfortunately, and this is not a knock on K through 12 teachers, but with high stakes testing, students, there's some evidence to make you believe that students are coming to us more skeptical about the usefulness of what they learn. And so what I like about a genre approach and a relevant approach is they see right away that things are different in this class. And here's a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. You may have seen it. Calvin is talking to Miss Wormwood, and he says in the first panel there, yes, what assurance do I have that this education is adequately preparing me for the 21st century? Am I getting the skills I'll need to effectively compete in a tough global economy, et cetera, et cetera? To which he says, in that case, young man, I suggest you start working harder. What you get out of school depends on what you put in. And he says, oh, then forget it. Okay. But long we've been just saying, yes, students need to do it, work harder. Students need to find the relevance. It's up to them. I don't believe that at all anymore, and I don't think the field believes that anymore. So as I said before, you can surprise them with relevance because they're not expecting it. It shows them from the get-go that this course is going to be beginning. Have them work in genres that are important to them. We've talked about some of those before. And create beneficial expectancies by scaffolding assignments so that they're prepared to do that next assignment, to reach for that zone of proximal development. And also, this is something that is really nicely talked about in the Writing Across Context book, is encourage students to face up to and reflect on the challenges. In other words, to do postmortems of what Yancey, Robertson, and Taxet called critical incidents. This is where the real learning takes place, is when students writing practices fail, and they have to talk about why it fails. And this is something I haven't been doing as much as I'd like to, but we're going to start here. I'm going to run through these things pretty quickly and simply say that motivation is obviously it's a combination of students feeling it's relevant and also that they expect that with effort they'll be able to succeed at this, that they'll be successful. And finally, let me go to, be explicit that the transfer is the main goal of the course. Always talk about transfer. Reiterate and scaffold the ideas about transfer. Use it a lot. One thing we're doing a lot in my program to good effect is we share the SLOs with students, and we are explaining every single thing we're doing in terms of what we want them to learn using the key terms that are articulated in the SLOs. And saying things like, here's why I want you to do X. Always explaining the learning purpose behind them. And then also to have students reflect upon their experiences and strategies through the lens of these SLOs. And then finally, the last thing I would say is, you're going to have to adapt these strategies to your curriculum and your students. Even if you're a writing program administrator, you know that you can't change things all at once. Every school is different, has different missions, different students, and things are going to have to be adapted for your school. So I would say, following the advice in this terrific book, another Utah State Press, Organic Writing Assessment, which talks about how various people across the across the nation have worked to do dynamic criteria mapping to develop their curriculum, their outcomes in their programs. Okay. Finally, a little bit of further reading. If I were going to read just two things about this, they would be this first one, Transfer of Learning by Perkins and Solomon. You can buy the International Encyclopedia of Learning for, I think it was, I saw it on Amazon for $5,000. But luckily, this is on the web for free. And just Google it. Transfer of Learning, David N. Perkins and Gabrielle Solomon. And then the other book that I would read is Yancey, Robertson, and Taxick's Writing Across Context. It is a terrific book because it introduces the major issues and concepts in transfer of writing ability and knowledge in a way that's clear but sophisticated. They also document a qualitative research proposal where they research where they compared Teaching for Transfer course with an ordinary themed course. And then finally, what I really like about this is there's an abundance in the appendix of actual things they do. Since they gave the syllabi they use, as well as their research protocols and their research methods, their interview techniques, which are a really great model for anybody who wants to do program research. College Writing Beyond, I've talked about a little bit before. It's a qualitative study of one student. How people learn is really terrific. This middle one here, Composition Forum, this is available online as well. It's a special edition of Fall 2012, edited by Elizabeth Wardle. What's really great about this is it is several authors talking about specific ends of things, including things like threshold concepts. And then finally, there's this book, The End of Composition Studies, which, as I mentioned earlier, sort of was kind of the catalyst for this whole thing. It's a I feel is answered well. I have. This helps. I hope this introduced you to some of the ideas and concepts and strategies for teaching for transfer. And Rick and I could take some questions.
Okay, well, so this is kind of an interesting question, I thought, Chuck. Since the term transfer is problematic, why do you think we continue to use it?
Because it has been around for over 100 years. It's been part of learning. It's been part of learning theory and teacher education for 100 years. And by and large, people understand what we mean when we're talking about transfer of learning. Mm-hmm. However, I think administrators, as teachers, we should all be reflective practitioners and understand the limitations of that term, and that it does suggest some things that just don't accurately describe what's involved. It makes it seem too simple. Does that help?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a good answer. We'll see if Catherine, who asked the question, wants to ask a follow-up.
Elizabeth Wardle, in I believe it's the editorial essay of the Composition Forum, has a really nice discussion of the problem with transfer, as well as lots of other stuff that she's done.
Great, thank you. You mentioned the importance of helping students to or of the need for students to have a shared critical vocabulary. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions about ways to facilitate acquisition of a common critical vocabulary.
Reiteration. You can't repeat things too much. In our program, we're encouraging our teachers to begin every class period by when they're talking about this is what we're going to do today, to put it in terms of the student learning outcomes, and which include the key terms that we use in our program. So they're using them all the time. And it's not just us talking about them. We're having them talk to each other about them as they're doing peer review, for instance. We make sure that they're using them again and again. And the Writing Across Context book, Yancey, Robertson, and Taxac book talk about this in interesting ways. It's more important that they use them than that they be able to define them.
I see.
Does that, yeah, is that clear? Rick, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. Well, I was going to chime in that, in the writing lab, the problem is if students are coming in with a lot of different vocabularies, it's really hard for our tutors to kind of help them. Because, we've got 200 different instructors teaching over 300 sections, so you could imagine the kind of, Babylon kind of effect we've got going on there if we've got people using very different vocabularies. It helps if they're using some, and I don't think the ones that Yancey put up there that Chuck showed on the slide, that's a pretty nice universal set. I didn't see any, we quibble over which ones are better and whether we'd replace them. But in general, I don't think they're dramatically out of line. It's just helpful if we have a more consistent set that we're working from.
And each school is going to want to emphasize and foreground and use different ones. For instance, in our program, we have a lot of second language learners and a lot of first-generation students. So a very key term for us, and we introduced this in the very first week, is discourse communities, and their first assignment is doing an analysis and a description of their discourse communities that they belong to, the various ones.
Yeah, so that's a good example. We can really argue theoretically about discourse communities, but on the other hand, you're kind of like, well, it's a pretty useful term, and for undergraduates, it works pretty well. The rest of us can fight over this about conceptual schemes and all this other theoretical stuff, but in the end, that term is pretty helpful, and they get it and they understand what they're being asked to do with it. So,
and it's more important that you have one. I don't think there's any right one. I'm not.
Chuck, are you still there? There was kind of a little sound on the line. We didn't quite hear. I heard you say.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I just missed. I think we all just missed kind of the last piece of what you were saying, which is, not so much that there's one right vocabulary, but.
Yeah, I don't think that there's. As Rick said, there's no universal vocabulary that everybody should use, but it is important for programs and or teachers to choose one and to select one. And again, the Goldilocks, principle is what applies here. It should be as simple as possible. I guess this is Einstein, not Goldilocks, right? It should be as simple as possible and no simpler, right?
Sounds like Occam's razor to me.
I was thinking that too. It's like somewhere between Goldilocks and Einstein and Occam. There's the real principle.
Yeah.
One of the advantages I was going to point out to some of this way of talking about teaching writing is that administrators get this. So when they're asking you about your writing program, I know that I've been trying to educate, the president of our university, who's very bright, and it's Mitch Daniels, and he's nationally known, and he wants to know what we're doing in our writing programs to kind of meet the goals of, Purdue, which is by all means, by any measure a STEM university. So it's kind of this kind of stuff really works for them. They understand. We show them the genres we're teaching, and we don't enforce a certain set of genres, but we like, people to basically be choosing us from a set that's recognizable, and then we show how those then map to, like maybe the junior level where they're taking advanced writing courses, and then map into, kind of post-college. We don't always have to talk about careers. That's helpful, but, even just taking citizen action, how to communicate with the broader public. I think all that works really well with administrators, this kind of talk. It's kind of hard to sell them on the whole comparison and contrast paper or the cause and effect paper, but it is pretty easy to sell them on things like, proposals, on doing an elevator pitch, reports, reviews, things that sound like real genres to them.
I couldn't agree more. It's just talking to deans and provosts and the president about what we do. It just makes a lot of sense to them. So get your own elevator, create your own elevator pitch about what you're doing in your program, because you'll be using it a lot.
That's a neat idea, and it goes along with this whole idea of, you know, articulating for students too that, you know, what you're trying to get to. So, you know, the elevator pitch is, you know, it's useful in talking to front campus and talking out, you know, outside of campus, but I could see where a kind of modified elevator pitch for students would be
Yes.
Helpful.
Yes. Right. Yes.
So interesting. Well, if there are any other questions that folks want to ask, they can go ahead and use that question pane over there on the side, or follow-up questions. I know sometimes that question pane is hiding under the orange arrow, so if anybody's having a hard time finding it, you might want to look to the orange arrow on the right. And otherwise, I don't have any more questions. Do you guys have any questions for each other? Questions for me? Questions for Steve or from our audience?
Questions for our audience? Oh, I guess I'd be curious how, you know, how the conversation in the discipline, has certainly been, I would say, almost dominated by conversations like this one. How it's affected what people are doing on campus, how new an idea this is for people, and what other resources and help they need from the field or from, you know,
that's a great
other
question.
colleagues. What's missing that's keeping you from exploring this further or enacting it?
Well, that's a great question. And we have a couple questions that came in, so while we wait for the audience answers to Chuck's question, one of the questions that has come in is asking, does the fact that we're teaching Gen C have anything to do with the fact that students are connecting the learning? Could it be that we're not explicitly telling them that it does connect? There's that pinging sound is on the line again. Chuck, can you say again?
Generation C? Is it,
I think it must.
Or is it not general education? Okay.
Yeah, I think it must mean Generation C.
I don't know. That's a really good question. That's a really good question. Well, I mean, one thing I find, the reason that I teach first year comp as, you know, as often as I can, despite pressures, you know, for me not to teach it, is because I find the students change every 2 years, and you know, and in order to keep up with them, I can't keep up with them, but in order to try, I have to change what I do. I don't know. I mean, I know that's a really good question.
Well, there's a kind of an equally complex and ever-changing question. One of our audience members wonders, you know, can you suggest some good ways to encourage students to just start writing? I mean, I think the microgenres are a good strategy for getting students to just dive in, but what do you think?
Yeah, you know, I'll let Rick talk about this because he's better at this than I am, but it is, yeah, I think starting a sequence with fun genres. I mean, don't underestimate the role of fun. Students really enjoy doing some of these things, sharing them, reading them. You know, we watched this great video rant called if you Google rant spell checkers autocorrect. There's a great rant that students love, and then they find something to rant about that, and that leads to more serious, more professional, more academic ones. Rick?
Yeah, I like the idea of microgenres or memes, you know, kind of just having them explore those things. They chase after that stuff on the internet anyway. Anything that's going viral is kind of an interesting thing to explore as a meme or as a, you know, to ramp it up a little bit of microgenre. I think doing that stuff in class kind of is helpful. My only concern is that with this kind of high stakes testing kind of training that's going on in high school, they come in with that kind of got to solve a problem, got to finish this thing kind of mentality about their writing. And that often, you know, leads to this kind of just got to get this done kind of thinking, as opposed to just writing just to kind of play with words and wordsmith. Chuck mentioned, you know, playing around with metaphors and tropes and stuff. Those are fun, you know what I mean? I don't mean to always go with the fun thing. Not everything's an entertainment kind of thing, but I think
Right.
it's motivational to get them thinking about doing something for the enjoyment of writing, and then that helps them kind of see that these bigger projects that we're asking them to ramp up to or scaffold up to aren't quite as painful and work oriented as they think. It's still fun to write a proposal, just as fun as it was to write the pitch. It's just a much bigger document, more complexity. So.
And as I was saying before, I think you actually can do a little sort of jujitsu and use that to your advantage. I mean, because they expect writing to really, many of our students, to really be unenjoyable and irrelevant. And if you start off by changing their minds about this, they instantly understand, oh, this is different. You know, and also puts them in the state of a novice, which is a good state to be in, because we are teaching them new things. We don't want them just to use the strategies that they used before, because we're asking them to do more complex things. And I use that in my something teachers across our program say is, wow, this is really different. This is really different kind of writing. So.
Well, sort of, somewhat related. And I know we're technically out of time, but the webinar is not going to shut off automatically. So if you have a minute to answer this, I think you'll be interested in this question from Sarah DeBacher at University of New Orleans. Fabulous person. She's wondering about advice for WPAs wanting to open a conversation about key terms, particularly with senior faculty. They have a very diverse body of folks teaching composition there. They have, TAs who are generally willing to try new things, instructors who are, maybe a little more set in their ways but still open, and then senior faculty who are often very resistant to change. And so she's wondering about getting that conversation started with them productively.
And having those conversations and recognizing that you will never create your ideal writing program. Not if you have teachers you respect and like and will learn from. I have two younger colleagues here. They're both in their third years of assistant professors. Kristen Elder, who's Rick's former student, and Bethany Davila from Michigan, and I have learned so much from them. They have really helped played such a huge role in transforming this our program. It's still happening. I mean, you don't do it overnight. That book, Organic Writing Assessment, and other things that Linda Adler, she's one of the authors of that book, and other things that Linda Adler-Kastner has written, talk about this a lot in really great ways about reframing and carrying out those conversations, which are absolutely necessary. You can, if you impose what you're doing, it just won't work, because you'll end up being the secret police if that's what you want to do, and that's no way to live a life or run a program. But I totally understand, and I wish I had something better to say than just patience and listen and conversation, and you can't be too idealistic.
Thanks, Chuck. Rick, was there anything you wanted to add to that, or shall we end on that note?
Yeah, senior faculty, you've got to kind of work with them, hopefully bring them into the process and explain what you're trying to do. I mean, your lectures and grad students, you can kind of, with every new generation, you have an opportunity to kind of bring new things in. We caucus at the beginning of every semester, and that gives the writing program a chance to say, here's something else we're going to add. But what Chuck says is right. It's got to be kind of a gradual process. What you're trying to do is improve quality, and you got to create these quality feedback loops. And the way to do that is just try and change small things about the system at a time. And eventually people kind of get on the same page and your quality does improve. And that's what hopefully assessment will show for you, is that you're getting those quality improvements you were looking for. So, but yeah, it's as Chuck says, it's a process. It's not something you just come in and say, guess what, we've got a new regime and here we go.
Right.
And if I can throw in, this isn't really, I guess it's sort of a shameless plug, the Council of Writing Program Administration, their summer conference, offers a workshop, for a WPA workshop, 3-day workshop this next year. It's going to be in July in Boise, and I am co-leading that workshop with coming up, and that's always really it's a good way to meet other new, usually young WPAs, and work with them and to learn some of these strategies and to work through your overall strategy. The person I'm working with is Peggy O'Neill. Anyway, from sorry.
No trouble. Well, thank you guys so much, and it was great to have you, and for everyone, the audience, we are going to post the slides and the recorded WebEx. So if there were things that you didn't quite get written down or want to review, you'll have an opportunity to do that. That'll be on our open access professional development site, pedagogyandpractice.pearsonhighered.com, in the next week or two. So keep an eye out for that, and I hope to see you all on a future Thursday afternoon. So thanks again.
Thanks everybody for hanging in there, and thank you, Amy.
Oh yeah, thank you guys. It was great to talk with you.
All right, bye-bye.